All right, this is lecture number 3. This will be a shorter lecture, but lecture number 3 for Unit 1, Causes, Effects, and Practices of War, covering World War I for IB 20th Century World Topics. So Allies win the war, or in other words, we will ultimately try to evaluate why Germany lost the war. So what will this lecture or topic cover? We want to look at the state of the war at the end of 1916 into the situation for 1917. We will cover and touch on unrestricted submarine warfare and the Allied blockade. We will see Russia exit and America enter. And then we will look at the German Spring Offensive of 1918, the 100 Days Offensive, and then events that led to the armistice on November 11th, 1918. Most of number 4, 5, and 6 will be done in collaborative learning groups. We will briefly touch on 1, 2, and 3. So conclude in 1916. What's the deal with World War I? Well, Germany has advanced well into Russia by the end of 1916. And in fact, we will see by the end of 1917, the Russians and the Germans have agreed to an armistice that will eventually lead to Russia's withdrawal from World War I and the Eastern Front to be over. Another important feature to note that plays into the year 1916 would be the German use of unrestricted submarine warfare. So we know that the British live on an island, of course, and so they really depend and rely on merchant shipping to sustain their population and ultimately to sustain the war effort as well. On the map on the right, you see right there in the bottom corner the British reliance on imported foods in 1917. So even though this is in 1917, it does give you some idea of the British reliance on imported foods in general. So, if they rely 100% on imported foods for sugar, cocoa, chocolate in 1917, we can probably guess and speculate that, they're relying close to 100% in the years prior to 1917 as well. And you see some of these other staples, of a diet and the British reliance on goods. So the Germans know this. The Germans know that the British rely on imported goods to sustain a population. So if this war is going to take on a total war feature, what the Germans will do is, beginning in 1915, they pursue a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. And so that means that the German U-boats will go out and mostly they have declared that the waters off the coast of Great Britain are part of they consider it to be a war zone. And so unrestricted submarine warfare, that any ships that are entering these waters are subject to be torpedoed and sunk without discrimination. And this obviously affects British merchant ships, but this also affects the United States as well. United States ships will be subject to the German policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which we will talk about here in a little bit. We also see passenger liners. They will be targets of unrestricted submarine warfare. On May 7th, 1915, a British passenger liner, the Lusitania, is hit and sunk. We have 128 Americans that lose their lives due to the sinking of the Lusitania, and this will start to play a contributing role to America's opinion of Germany, and the idea of unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting even a neutral country such as the United States, will be a major contributing factor to America's entrance into the war. The Germans do pledge on May 4th, 1916 to stop the policy or to pause the policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, and they pledged that to Woodrow Wilson in the United States in something called the Sussex Pledge. So they do put a halt on unrestricted submarine warfare, but you see that it is an integral part of their war efforts to stop the the British from attaining the necessary goods. So this will be a temporary pause until 1917. And when we talk about the Germans resuming restricted submarine warfare, I would go back to this first slide here and looking on the at the map on the left. By 1916, the British and the French attacks had failed to achieve a major breakthrough. We see that primarily at the Somme. By November of 1916, we have 500,000 lives lost, but very little territorial gain to show for it. And by the end of 1916, the French are just holding on to dear life, losing over 500,000 men at Verdun. But that was primarily a defensive stand, so very little offense, right, or breakthroughs are happening. In 1916, Italy had joined the Allies, but they had made little progress in their fighting against Austria. And the British had failed to eliminate Turkey by attacking at Gallipoli and was defeated in Iraq by the Turks. So, like on all fronts here, seems like the Central Powers hold a decisive advantage. The situation doesn't get much better for the Allies in 1917 because Russia is going to withdraw from the war. So a couple causes of Russian withdrawal from World War I. The failure of the Gallipoli campaign. Once again, that was an attempt by the Allies to open up, access to Russia through the Dardanelles Straits. We see that Gallipoli campaign to be a complete failure. We're looking at in the ballpark of 250,000 casualties in this failed campaign to open up that warm water access to Russia for the Allies. We see Russia having failed campaigns and offensives in 1916. The Brusilov offensive is one that comes to mind. This was an offensive launched in 1916 by the Russians. It had some short-term success, but ultimately it's going to be pushed back by the Germans. So once again, this could be another example of a failed offensive. If you look here on the image to your right, the shortages that the Russian soldier and the Russian people experienced due to poor management results in multiple strikes, riots, just general discontentment and disgruntlement on all fronts for the Russians, the war front and the civilian front. And we see large demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations, food riots that are happening in the capital city of Petrograd and all over the Russia. And it's really a chant of bread and peace, bread and peace, bread and peace. The results of these troubles and obstacles that Russia is experiencing, we see in February of 1917, we have a revolution, and Tsar Nicholas II has lost confidence and control over military, political, industrial leaders by February 1917, and we see that once again in this image. You see some, a timeline and some locations here where that's occurring. In February 1917, the Tsar abdicates the throne, and you see a provisional government set up in Russia, which does two things here. Number one, it moves Russia towards more of a democratic state. And that's going to be key here for people like Woodrow Wilson. And number two, they make the crucial decision to stay in the war. That's going to pose a problem for the provisional government because that decision to stay in the war does not address the needs and the wants of the people. And so by November of 1917, we have Vladimir Lenin returning from exile. He is a communist leader that the Germans helped return from exile to Russia. In November of 1917, you'll see the Russians stage a second revolution in which the provisional government is going to be overthrown. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks take over the government, and they immediately pounce on this campaign of bread, peace, and land. And by December of 1917, they agree to an armistice. And by March of 1918, the Russians have signed a treaty with the Germans that will officially withdraw them from the war. This is known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Russia gets out of the war, but they give up a bunch of territory that ends up being 34% of the population they give up, 32% of their farmland they give up with the treaty, 50% of their industry they give up with the treaty, and 90% of their coal mines, right, they give up. So they get out of the war, but at a huge cost. Why would they do this? Trotsky, who is a Bolshevik leader, a leader of this revolution, he says this is a peace that Russia, grinding her teeth, is forced to accept. They have to accept, in the eyes of Lenin and Trotsky and all the other Bolsheviks, they have to accept these peace terms so they can get out of the war and to save the revolution, this Bolshevik or this communist revolution that they're trying to implant in Russia. They say, all right, to get out of the war and to save the revolution, they need to accept these terms. So they don't like it, but they feel like they have no other choice. The effect that this has on the Allies is it's going to cause Great Britain and France to step up their war effort. It's going to cause a little bit more of a sense of urgency for the Americans who are in this war by November of 1917 to actually get their butts over here and to become an actual presence in this war. Because what's happening here is that the Germans are able to now take those troops that were fighting on the Eastern Front and send them over to the Western Front. Speaking for the United States officially entered the war on April 4th, 1917. Some causes for U.S. involvement in World War I. Loans to the Allies. American bankers have loaned about $1.5 billion in loans to the Allies, so they want to see that money paid back, and so it's in their financial interest to support the Allies. We see Allied propaganda. The British control the telegraph wires across the Atlantic, so as early as 1914, when the Germans are marching through Belgium, the Americans are getting their news reports from the British. So they're hearing of German atrocities, and they're hearing just essentially, through 1915, 1916, 1917, one side of the story, and that's the British side. So the Germans are already being painted as the enemy, and as someone who most Americans wouldn't want to support. They don't have the shared interest that the British and the French have with the Americans. The Germans don't make it any easier on themselves. We have in late January, early February, the British are able to intercept and to provide the Americans with what's called the Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram is a telegram that was sent from Arthur Zimmermann to the government of Mexico in early 1917. And this is telling the Mexicans that the Germans are planning on resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, and that they realize that this might get the United States involved. So in addition for Mexican support in this war against the Allies and eventually against the United States, the Germans will pledge that the Mexicans can get back the territory lost in the Mexican-American War. So we're looking at territory that's parts of California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, and Texas. The Germans pledge that they will give back to the Mexicans if the Mexicans will pledge their support to the Central Allies in this war against the United States and pledge their support to the Central Powers in Germany's war against the United States and the Allies. I think the biggest one would be unrestricted submarine warfare. This seems to be the big thing that Wilson hits on in his war speech, or his declaration of war speech, and this seems to be the one that's the biggest thorn in the side of most Americans, is that even as a neutral country, they seem to be targets and casualties of war, and this doesn't jive with them. So if you read Wilson's war speech on April 2nd, 1917, he does make a point of emphasis here with unrestricted submarine warfare. I think Wilson in general, he is a contributor to why the Americans get involved in this war. We see as early as January 22nd, 1917, Wilson is making speeches that kind of outline his idea or vision of what the world should be fighting for, and also, we can see if we read between the lines that he's kind of implying that he could play a role in dictating these terms of the peace, or what this post-war world would look like. On January 22nd, 1917, Wilson has a speech that is outlining his idea of a peace without victory. So he's saying that we should have this peace, but we shouldn't have the spoils of war that traditionally we have seen the victors impose upon the people that lose this war. So peace without victory. Nobody would get any sort of territorial gains or force upon the defeat of these huge concessions. We'll see that doesn't really turn out the way Wilson wants. On April 2nd, 1917, in his declaration of war speech, he proclaims that the United States must enter this war to make the world safe for democracy. So this speaks to Wilson's idealism as to what America's purpose in this war should be. And then a little bit later, January 8th, 1918, he makes his 14-point speech, and we'll look at the 14 points a little bit more later. So today, or the next time we see each other in class, we will look at evaluating why Germany lost in World War I, and we will specifically hone in on 4 key factors or events of the war from 1917 to 1918, and dividing up responsibility for Germany's loss, focusing on these events. It's the Kiel Mutiny of 1918. It's the overall effects of the Allied naval blockade that's happening. It's the failure of the German Spring Offensive of 1918 and the ensuing 100 Days Offensive by the Allies, leading from essentially August 8th, 1918 through November 11th, 1918. And then American involvement and arrival of American troops, looking at and deciding which one of these factors should bear the greatest amount of responsibility for contributing to Germany's loss. And we'll do this through a pie chart exercise. If you have any questions, please bring them to class next time we see each other, and I hope this gives you some sort of context as far as the state of World War I, concluding 1916 and entering 1917, 1918.